Bach prelude for you. That's by Johann Sebastian Bach, the first prelude of his Well-Temperklavier Book 1. One of the reasons why I play that for you is it helps to remind us how, if we know how to write a good chord progression, we can actually get a pretty nice piece of music out of it that doesn't actually have to depart too far from the kinds of models that we're working with in the course itself. That's not always easy for us to appreciate or to see, because these kinds of exercises that we do, where we learn some basic moves, it's like learning your tennis strokes one stroke at a time. It's hard to see how you can actually bring a whole game together out of that, at least initially. But for example, this piece that I've just been playing for you, if we just consider the first few measures, I actually have a chord progression that comes right out of our textbook. I think it's chord progression 26, which is where we go from a tonic chord to a supertonic seventh that's in third inversion, so it's a 2-4-2 chord, to a 5-6-5 chord, so from one seventh chord to another, and then back to one. And it sounds like this. Now, when I was discussing this in the previous video, what I was using more than anything was the minor mode. And the reason for that was just I happened to really like the supertonic seventh in a minor mode. And I think I kind of undersold the major mode use of it just a little bit. I mean, this really is a pretty classic use of tonic. There's a supertonic 7-2-4-2 going directly to 5-6-5. And then back to 1. And again, that was one of the reasons why, of the three uses of inversions, the first two, 2-6-5, 2-4-3, I was always resolving those to a 5 chord. I said for the last one, I want to see if I can't go directly from one seventh chord to another. And it's kind of a neat effect. We can hear it right here, where this is the third of the 2-4-2. And if I hang on to it, you can hear that third of one seventh chord turning into the seventh of the next, and then resolving. So it's a classic use, a textbook use. One difference, of course, is to create this pattern, Bach writes in 5-part harmony. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then he repeats the 3, 4, 5. And one thing that you can learn from a piece like that is if you actually put all these components together, like this, you can see Bach making choices. Bach knew how to write for 4-part choir as well as anybody, to put it mildly. He also knew what he was doing when he would be slowly expanding his texture. So into 5 parts, you'll notice that Bach is very judicious in what he chooses to double. So if I have just a triad, I get to double 2 chord components. The first one, he seems to want a really bright sound, so he doubles both the root and the third. When he moves to his 2-4-2 chord, because he's got 5 parts to play with, he decides to play it safe and he just doubles the root. And then when he goes to the 5-7 chord, the 5-6-5, the one thing he's cautious not to do is to double either of the tendency tones, neither the leading tone or the seventh. Those are by themselves. He happens to double the 5th because it fits his voice leading very well. So you can hear how, even if you're not literally working with 4-part harmony, there's still a way in which the kind of balance of sounds that we've been very attentive to, are we doubling our root, are we doubling our 5th, are we doubling our 3rd, you can still pay attention to that kind of balancing act here. So this is a great piece of music to learn. How can I move, for example, from 4 parts to 5, and then from there. The other thing that we can notice is that Bach isn't just running through his chord tones like that. A technique that we call arpeggiation. It's like an arpeggio. We're playing them one after the other. But of course, there is, beneath all of that consonant skipping around going on, there are underlying voice leading things taking place. So if I consider, for example, just the bass and the soprano, taking place below the surface that suggests a kind of contrapuntal relationship. But what if we listen to another piece of Bach where we weren't literally having chords spelled out for us with a counterpoint buried underneath? What if we turned it around? What if we actually had the counterpoint being the most prominent aspect of the texture with a harmony buried underneath? A piece like this. So this is from the Bach Partita in C minor, the Sarabande. And the reason why I play this one right after the C major prelude is because both of those pieces are making quick use of supertonic seventh in third inversion. So that was the last harmonic topic that we dealt with on our previous video. But what's very different here is that what we have are two melodic lines that don't sound as if they are completely detached from harmony. It's kind of like a stream that's flowing over top of a harmonic substructure. So the contours of the harmony are kind of permeating how the melodic lines move. And one of the things we want to do is see how Bach is doing that. So what I'm going to do next is go back to a very conventional chord progression. I'm going to write it out in a very conventional way. It'll look like something straight out of our textbook. But then what we want to do is see if we can kind of retrofit it into what we get from Bach. And so to do that, I will shift the camera around again and we'll take a look at the board. So here we are. We're going to break down that Bach piece by going to something very simple and then building up from there. The first thing I want to draw our attention to is the fact that we are often looking at patterns that are useful to us in the textbook, but they are anything but comprehensive. There have been several times where he's given us some basic models and I said, well, these are just as basic. One thing that we didn't consider at all was a very important melodic line where the supertonic seventh tends to get used quite a lot. It's this melodic line. I have scale degree 3, going down to scale degree 2, going down to scale degree 1, something that before I've told you is often harmonized with a cadential 6/4, 5 chord, or 5/7, 2/1, and that's a pattern that you can use, especially when you're doing tricky modulations, to really convince listeners that you've gone into a particular key that might not be the home key. It's a very powerful way to proceed. Well, you can also kind of stretch out this scale degree 2 in such a way that you can harmonize it with more than one harmony. You can have an actual tonic, subdominant, dominant, and tonic function progression here. And that's what I'm showing. This is written as though we're in C major, chord 1, 2, 4, 2, 5, 6, 5, and back to 1. And this is a pattern that we don't see in our textbook, but it is used all the time. So what I've done here is drawn it out in C minor, and you can see how this idea of being able to harmonize scale degree 2 in two different ways, I've literally separated out and done that. So you can see characteristic keyboard scoring, and I'm using tonic harmony 2, half diminished 4/2, 5/6, 5/1, and I'll play that for you now. This is what it sounds like. So that's a very nice chord sequence, but what's also nice is if I go back to more open spacing and a vocal scoring. And I want to hear what that sounds like. That's what I've done here. Literally, you can see that I've just taken this kind of inside voice, removed it and tucked it down there, and I've got lovely spacing between these parts. So what I'm going to do now is play this, followed by that, so that you can hear the change in sonority as I move from a little bit more cramped writing style. And remember, we do this a lot for the sake of convenience, that we can see the bass line very clearly with the information associated with the bass line, the figured bass, the Roman numerals. Our brain can grab hold of that in one space, and in the other space it can see the voice leading that connects all of the other parts a little bit more easily, the way they all move in connection to each other. this is always a little bit more tricky to read, but I think musically it has a very nice effect. So I'll play the more closed spacing in keyboard scoring and then shift to the more open spacing with vocal scoring. So even on an instrument like the piano, you can already hear how much more beautifully the sonority is distributed when it's spaced out that way. Now remember, of course, I've talked about this earlier in the course, where sometimes composers can really decide that they do want to kind of mush things together to have a particular sound effect. And I think the example that I used before was Beethoven with his Waldstein Sonata. That's Beethoven being Beethoven, wanting to create a kind of tension between stuff that's crunched together in a low register and this melody that's being kind of fired up high, and he's creating a gigantic space. He wants a great big void in the middle that he will then jump into with full force. Now, what Bach is going to do is to take this kind of pattern and find some way to give us a sense of it, even though he's writing with just two parts. Now, the first thing I want to do is take advantage of the fact, as I love to, when I have a vocal scoring, I can start to play around with the components. And I note, for example, that there's a lovely opportunity for a passing tone right there that I could tuck in. Also, it could be kind of fun to do something like this, have a suspension over there, and if I wanted a little bit more motion taking place, I could move this thing back up here in the alto, and what I had in the alto before, I could pop down into the tenor, which would give me the opportunity for what might seem like a passing tone, but would actually be 5/6 turning into 5/6/5 at that point, and then back to 1. So we get a little bit more motion that way. I'll just play that for us. Okay, so I've jazzed it up just a little bit, but now I start to get ideas, ways in which I could kind of combine what's happening in one part with what's happening in another. And by these two parts, what I mean is I'm going to have two melodies that will try to pass through all the essential chord tones and then embellish them with other non-chord tones or chord tone associates. Just to give you the basic idea, the spacing that I originally had was that there's a way in which, if I wanted to, I could kind of start to turn it into a melody by rocking back and forth between the voices in each part. Something like that, right? So then what happens is, if I listen, for example, to just the bass part, in the bass clef, I should say. There's a way in which I've gone through all of those chord tones as though it was just one voice, one melodic line, rocking back and forth. The melody that would be in the tenor and soprano parts again, I'm rocking back and forth and capturing all of the essential chord tones. So what I've done then is taken these chord tones, since they were originally written with half notes, I've used unfill, that is half note heads, in what Bach actually wrote, so that you can see the underlying voice leading taking place. So in the treble part, there it is, and in the bass clef, drops it down by the octave. So in each case, what I can now do is fill in things. So if I look at the part that's now in the bass, the single part that's there, I have that passing tone that I used before, little lower neighbor right there, bunch of chord tones, little lower neighbor there. That is where I move from 5/6 to 5/6/5, because remember, this is part of an inner voice implicitly. It's a little bit of the idea of the waltz, right, where we have the position of the harmony coming from the downbeat. So tonic harmony in root position. That's dominant seventh, but it's in its second inversion. It's a 5/4/3, and then that's the dominant seventh in its first inversion. All right. So same idea here. We're getting the 5/6 from the downbeat. I'm still hearing that as the functional bass part through this. That's in an upper voice. Okay, so that's how I can come up with this lovely bass line. I've got my good old friend, the chord tone associate there, which provides a bit of scaffolding for passing tone. This thing, I mean, if I view it just literally the way it's sitting there, would have to be an appoggiatura approach by leap, left by step. But functionally speaking, that is a suspension. It's the suspension of that third of tonic harmony over here. So I would just note that for myself there. Here's another chord tone associate, another little piece of scaffolding, which makes possible this passing tone to it. I come to, this is where I've moved over to my 2/2 diminished 4/2. Here, this is something that is anticipating the 5/6/5, so I would be tempted to refer to that as a chord tone associate, creating a piece of scaffolding for me here, this passing tone, that will also turn into a chord tone associate here for tonic harmony. It's kind of anticipating this. This voice is slightly ahead of this one, and this, of course, is an appoggiatura, like a lower neighbor that's hopping down and coming to the chord tone, and on we go. So if I put these parts together now, my original idea was this. This is how Bach realizes it. And I'm sorry I don't have space to write the rest of the music there, but again, you could find that score quite easily online. There are lots of PDF versions of that around. In any event, I hope this gives you some ideas for ways in which you can take these very basic chord patterns that we're learning in the course and develop them into really interesting pieces of music. Think about the fact that Bach probably didn't sketch this out as a basic chord progression. I mean, those were so much in his mind already, he wouldn't have to do something like that. His ear would be guided by those chord progressions. So if you internalize them very deeply, as Bach did, I can't imagine how deeply embedded they were in his mind and in his creative imagination. They provide a kind of template for your inner creativity to work with and grow around. And so I think it's a wonderful example, once again, of our dear old friend chord 2 half diminished 4/2. I love that harmony. Think of how often Bach is using chord 2 4/2. So if it works for Bach, it should work for us. Thank you very much.